Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Cry, and today I have the special opportunity to extend our chess lecture training program by means of an interesting analysis. A friend of Chess Lecture, a student of Chess Lecture, sent me a game selection of his and asked me to do an analysis, and this was one of the games in that section. And playing black in this game is Sagar Shah from India, who's made, I think, a great deal of progress listening to the site. And in this game, I'm going to highlight some very basic things that I think if Sagar works on, he'll be able to improve dramatically. And I also think that what I'm going to recommend for him is very typical of players moving from 2200 to 2400, which is where he is at the moment. So in this game, he is black against a GM named Fomin, who's from the Soviet, or previously a Soviet player with a lot of experience. And the game goes like this: knight f3, knight f6, c4, b6, g3, c5, bishop g2, bishop b7, castles. This has been seen many times. e6 is a standard move here. Sagar plays g6, which is totally fine. And now, the most testing move is d4, but in a for us, very interesting, what's going to happen here is that Fomin plays the old variation, Smyslov variation, b3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles, knight c3. Now, my sense, gleaned from Sagar's notes that you can see in the file, of which I've addended some of my own thoughts, is that Sagar thought this position was basically very equal. And this is very deceptive, actually. White still has a little bit of an advantage, and black should be respectful of that and probably just play a move like knight a6. Now, if we look at the position, really all of white's moves have been logical. The only problem, if any, is that his knight and his bishop are a little bit discoordinated. So if white could somehow resolve that without losing any time, there's no reason to think that he wouldn't have a standard opening advantage. Let's look at what Sagar plays. d5. And now, knight takes d5. Exclam. Now, Sagar says he missed this, but really you're playing a GM and you need to realize that he's not going to play c takes, knight takes, allowing black complete freedom of play. Also, when we're sensitive to white's problems, namely this constellation of bishop b2 and knight c3, we'll more easily anticipate a move like knight d5. Nevertheless, Sagar thinks that this is no great problem for him. Knight takes c5, knight takes, bishop takes g7, king g7, pawn takes, queen takes, d4. Now here Sagar plays a reasonable move, knight a6, but the problem here is more Sagar's intuition or appreciation of this position, which he thinks is equal. For example, he gives this position: pawn takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes, king takes as equal. And for me, that's a very interesting and kind of funny assessment. Funny in a couple respects. So this position was reached twice by Smyslov, who won in beautiful style, once against Benko and once against a player named Castro, I believe. And I'm actually going to cover that in the next lecture I do, which is going to be part 5 of my series on Smyslov. And what's the point? The point is that many players, particularly those going from 2200 to 2400, will see a symmetrical position here and sense that really the position will just have to be equal. But the position is in fact far from equal. White's knight is significantly better than the black knight. Significantly better. And not only that, but he's going to be up in time in the following position. Black's going to move his knight maybe to a6 or d7, and white's going to get another move with the rook. And these are small advantages which are very difficult for young and inexperienced players to sense that they could be dangerous for black. And if this kind of let's call it an endgame position, but it's really a question of harmony, is this kind of harmonious understanding that is in many ways the difference between a 2300 player like Chagall, who's very talented and has a great the game, particularly in complex middle game positions. He has a very nice feel of the position. And someone who's stronger, who has an appreciation that this position is in fact very, very dangerous for the black side. And we're going to see a little bit more of endgame style play in this game, a phase of the game in which Chagall could improve. Now let's take a look at how the game itself went. So Chagall played knight a6, still thinking the position's essentially equal. But here white has two interesting opportunities, depending, and he even has a choice depending on his style of play. If white wants to play an endgame style of position, he could play knight h4, queen d7's forced, and take. And you have to give us the d file. And no matter how you do this, maybe you take first and play knight c5, we're going to get some play on d7. You know, black's not lost or anything, but white can definitely claim a small advantage. The other more ambitious plan that white could have chosen here was to have played e4. The tactical point here is that if you take, knight h4 wins the bishop. And if you go back, we can push either e5 or d5 depending on where you go, and we're going to have a nice initiative. Both in the center and perhaps later against your king. For example, maybe queen d6, e5. And a pleasant initiative for white. Okay, so as it was, Fomin makes a mistake, and this allows Chagall to equalize the game fairly easily. As he takes, and this is a mistake because it's allowing that one bad piece of black's, that queen's knight, to come into the game without any major difficulty. Queen c2 is played, rook d8. Okay, rook d1, and now a reasonable move, queen c6. It looks a little funny, but there's nothing white can really do to take advantage of the queen on c6, and the queen might even later come to f6. b4, now Chagall plays a nice move, knight a4. So b4 is really questionable because this square is going to be a little bit delicate for white. And now, really, white should think about bailing with trading all the heavies and playing rook c1. But now understand that white is GM, he's higher rated, and he's obligated really to play for a win in this position. Plays queen b3. This is really giving black a little too much, though. Now we have knight c3. Now, the rook can never come to c1 because we have knight e2. So white trades. And now white has a trick, but really there's no trick here that's going to help white too much because the knight on c3 is just so strong. He plays queen f7. Chagall missed this, and I have a feeling this is understandable that you missed this, but this is also an element of the game in which Chagall can improve, especially if he's going to be playing now GMs to really try to reach for the IM title probably within the next year. King takes, knight e5, king e6, knight takes, bishop takes, rook d2. Good move. And now we have to say that Chagall has an advantage because he's going to get a pawn back, and both his rook is better than white's rook, and the black knight is better than the bishop, and black's king is better than the white king. Okay, Fomin played a4, maybe a3 is better. Knight takes pawn, king f1. Now here's the next phase of the game that I think is very important to talk about. Really, chess should be approached as if it weren't as complicated as it actually is. You need to try to break things down to try to make things understandable. And here, when we look at the position, really, our rook is fantastic. Our king is good, but it's not really clear where it wants to go yet. The knight, however, really needs to be relocated somewhere. And to my mind, the move knight d4 really screams to be played. the bishop on c6 is going to have to move, so it owes us a tempo, and we get to play this knight move for free. Now, I'm going to show a very similar variation in a second, so I'm just going to leave this knight d4 move for a moment. Black played king d6. So the problem is that when we ask ourselves, the king, rook, and the knight all get a chance to hit their bishop if they want to for a free tempo. The king on e6, though, it's not clear why it's that much better on d6 than it is on e6, whereas the knight clearly needs to move from e2. Okay, white played a mistake, which is going to allow us to look at this knight d4 variation and play bishop f3, allowing knight d4. A better move would have simply been to move the bishop maybe to b7 or a8, where it's not touched, and white might even have sufficient counterplay in that position. These positions are very delicate. I mean, we're playing someone, first of all, who's very resourceful. The bishop and rook might later become active, and our advantage, whether it's going to be winning or not, is really going to be a very fine line. But white gives us another chance here with the bishop f3. And now knight d4 would be very strong indeed. Now let's just say the bishop moves. Now, funnily enough, Chaga in his notes says something to the effect of a6 here, which I think is very misguided. He's thinking that, okay, b5 is going to come, this guy's going to get fixed, and there he'll have a weakness. But there's some basic principle mistakes that I sense going on here. Notice he's trying to fix that pawn on a dark square. And I think his intuition is that if he fixes it on a dark square, then it'll be easier for him to take. But really that's incorrect. If anything, we want to put his pawns on light squares because that'll interfere with the mobility of his bishop. So, for example, in this position with a6, we've actually allowing white to gain his own counterplay with a move like a5, fixing this pawn. And even though it's not like black's even worse here, the problem is that pawn will always give white counterplay, and that counterplay will help white save the game. So a much better strategy here, and one which really illustrates the power of black's position, play rook b2, force that pawn to a light square, and rook b4. We're tying down the rook. It's not so easy to see what white should do. Oh, actually, you know what? I made a small blunder myself here. But in any case, in the variation that I had given, bishop e4 was the main move. But that's just because it was in Chaga's notes. But in fact, we can go ahead and look at this position because it's similar in any case. Rook b4, and we have a very simple plan of playing knight b3 to c5. And notice that it really didn't matter that I changed the variation from Chaga's, where the bishop was on e4, the bishop was on a8, because here we have really free reign to improve our position really at will. Notice things like king e1, knight b3. There's no counterplay for white. Say rook here. We can always go into the endgame because those pawns that we've pushed under the light squares have now become very vulnerable to a later plan like king c5, king b4. And so one of the things I'd like Chaga to do, and for people going from 2200 to 2400, is really study these simple endgame positions. They're not simple in the sense that they're easy, but they're simple in the sense that it's reduced. And these will help us understand chess just at a more beautiful level, more insightful level. And one of the things I really enjoyed about Chaga's notes is he really has clearly a great love for the game. And that comes through in his notes. And I think once a chess player understands how these seemingly small things can become so important, they'll improve dramatically. And that's why for this training section from 2200 to 2400, I recommend studying Smyslow's Endgame Virtuoso, which I've covered some of those games at the site here, and I'm going to continue to do so in the next lecture. In fact, looking in my next lecture at that opening variation that Chaga had in this game. So let's look at the game. There's still some interesting points of endgame play here. Knight c3 was played. a5. White wants to trade off some pawns. rook b2, rook a3, knight b5, rook check. Now king e5 is impossible due to rook d5, king e6. Now at this point, I think white has fine play. Should be just more than enough for a draw. Bishop d5 was played, king e5, and now I don't like actually what Fomin played, even though Chaga gave it an exclam. I think white's best here would be to take and play bishop g8. Now that we're threatening h7, we're threatening rook d5, and really black needs to be a little concerned that the bishop and rook combo doesn't get too active. So this is going to be really heading for a draw. As it was, Fomin played bishop c6. And funnily enough, Chaga walks into his trap with knight d4. But in fact, if anything, I think it's white who's trapping himself here. Interesting enough, in this game, we've seen a couple moments where Chaga fell into white's trap, and it really didn't help white out at all. f4, king d6, rook takes, king takes. Now my sense is here, and from the notes, is that here Chaga felt that he had blown his advantage, but in fact, really the game's just getting started here. We have the better rook, we have the better king. There's no reason to think that we can't press for an advantage here. Rook e4, king d6, takes, and now white played h4. Okay, let's just look. E6 is a fine move that Chaga played. Now, this position is very dangerous for white, and probably he can draw, but in a lot of ways that's not what's interesting for us as black. For us, what's interesting as black is just trying to create enough problems here for the white pieces. Especially in a practical game, a lot of these games being played very quickly at the end of the time controls these days, we can give white a lot of grief in a position like this. Now, for example, one variation that Chaga gave that he thought white would be drawing quickly doesn't in fact work at all as far as I can tell, and that's h5, takes, rook e5, but now simply h4, exclam, takes, and the f4 pawn's hanging, with a winning position for black. So that kind of thing isn't yet ready to work for black. And so in this position, white played king g1. I think this is his best move. He should wait. And Chaga played h5, which isn't actually as bad of a move as he made it out to be in his notes, but I think not the best. Notice that white's just going back and forth. So if we're just thinking about logical play, we want to improve the position of our pieces before we make any kind of committal maneuver. And one instructive that I thought was interesting, variation rather, is b5. We'll just improve. King f1. And now I thought deeply about this position. I realized before I do anything like h5, I want the king to actually be away from this square. So I'm going to waste the tempo, h6, king g1, h5. Now the point is, once we play h5, we're locking down this square, but we're also inviting this kind of business with rook e5. Now, the general plan here for white for black is that if white sits, now we're going to come around. And this isn't so easy because we'll be coming this way and really threatening an invasion. And I give this variation in the notes. Let's look at, say, rook e5. Takes, rook g5, rook b2, takes, b4, exclam. And notice the point that we played h6 much earlier is now f5, we have rook e2, and the position is very dangerous for white. This pass pawn is immensely strong. And this, I think, would be a kind of standard way to push for an advantage for black, and especially with not too much time left for white. This position would be very scary indeed. Let's go to the game briefly. There was also one interesting moment in the final bit. Now, black offered a draw here. Oh, excuse me. Black played b5 immediately. h5, and then rook e5. And here there was, like I said, an interesting moment. Black can still play for some grief for the white pieces with rook b4, rook g5, rook d4 exclam, takes rook d5. And here white can indeed draw with probably king g2 and g4, but it's going to be a long road because b5 is coming. Notice that rook d5 will prevent any of this stuff of f5 and will also help restrain white's pawns once g4 is played. So my advice to Shoghi and many other players in this rating group of 22 to 2400 is to try to study positions that seem very simple or called simple. Some people call them symmetrical. Positions with very small differences in harmony that actually turn out to be very big. The opening one in particular, I think, was very important for my chess development, I think for others, where we see that Smyslov just has one piece better than his opponent and is able to carry that advantage, make it enduring all the way into the endgame. Now, in my training program, I've really recommended this book, Endgame Virtuoso, which is really just a collection of his games. Also really interesting are the Karpov endgames, which I'm also covering here at the site. And it's those kind of positions that players around this level, I find, really need to try to master when they're going up against strong GMs, to try to beat them in positions such as the one we got here, where Black had the nice knight versus bishop, which he gave away the advantage with that by playing knight c3, and even later he had the better rook endgame. In either of those cases he had excellent chances to win the game. So this is GM Jesse Cry, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Bye-bye.